I think she will.
Yeah, just make sure she's able to
No,
connect.
she's been chatting with me on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Till 10 minutes back, so she's okay.
Yeah, but she shouldn't have any trouble getting on the call.
Oh, hai. I think they did a dry run also, no?
Yeah.
Yes, KG.
Yes,
we had a dry
Saturday we
run.
had it right.
So today is a poll. We want to know, were you thinking of a pandemic at the start of Q4? Yes or no? So this is something Shefaly wanted to know, and probably she can tell us why so, and we can hear it from her. I request all the attendees to please do go ahead and put in your mentee answers. We are also conducting a survey to come back with season number 2 for Primetime at 9. So there is a link that we have been circulating. I hope everybody is filling that in, and we'd like to paste it here also here in the chat window. If somebody could help me with that, that would be great. You can put the links here on the chat box as well. We're just trying to know what our audience want, and probably come back with all those feedbacks weaved in for a perfect season 2 for our audience. So that's the idea.
Hey, Shefaly, welcome. This is Krishna Gopal.
Hi. Sorry,
Hi.
I'm just trying to figure out my camera is on. Can you see me?
Not yet.
It's showing me the camera is on. Let me just switch it off.
No, we can, Shefaly. I think you just switch it off.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out if I was invisible. Am I okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good.
Visible? Not to me, but I'm sure somebody is able to see you is fine.
Okay, that's cool. Audience focus, right? Target should be able to see the product.
Yeah. A lot of noise here. Who's the noisy guy? So, ladies and gentlemen, on this call, what we will do is, if it gets noisy, so we will mute all. And Shefaly, do note, we'll announce before we do that, Brahmastra kind of thing. And in which case you have to unmute yourself and restart, right? So just letting you know. It might come to that sometimes because you don't have this facility in Teams to, kind of flag off something called as mute on entry. So when they enter, they automatically muted.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, but that is there in WebEx, but in Teams, and then they don't realize.
It's in different web conferencing forms.
I know.
Like 8 to 9 now.
I know. Sujit is joined. Sujit is there. Sujit Bakshi is there on the call.
Yeah,
hi. I saw you.
Hi, Shefaly.
Jagdish is joined.
Hi.
Hi, Shefaly. How are you?
Hello.
Padma.
I can't see any of you, so I just have to
Okay,
guess.
let me get my camera on. I don't know if you can see me. Ah, there we are. Hi.
Hi. Hi, Padma.
Hi. Hey, Sujit. Sujit has also got his camera on now.
Yes.
Thank you everybody for joining us. I see a good number of attendees, so I want a good number of attendees on the Menti as well. Request all of you to go to menti.com. The code for you is 8890 04, and it's a poll today which says, at the start of Q4 2019, were you thinking of a pandemic? That's the question for you today. I think it's a simple click, a yes or a no. And I think I want all of my attendees to please go ahead and put in your answers and let us know what you think. This is right from Shefaly. So
Yes.
yeah, please go ahead to Menti. And before moving to the session, a few ground rules. Would request all of you to be on mute while Shefali is speaking, so that we give her a good decorum to go on with. And by the end of the speech, as we all know, there's a Q&A. You can put your questions, your views, your feedbacks on the chat window. That is, you just hover the cursor on your screen and you get a tab of features and you get this chat symbol. So please go on to that and put in your questions. By the end, we'll be reading them out. So these are the two things I'd request the audience to note. The audience is pouring in. We are at our peak time, Shefaly. This is the time we get most of our audience. So they're all coming in. Yes. Request all of you to do go to Menti and put in your views for us. It's just a yes or no. Thank you. I can see 15 of you have done it. Thank you so much. So can we probably show the poll? I'd still request all of you to do go to Menti, but let's see how. No. I think this was a guessable answer, but then one person still, foresee that something is coming. Probably they went to other countries like Padma just mentioned, and saw a few signs like people wearing masks or people being careful at the airport. So might be, yes, totally possible. 17 for no and 1 for yes. I think that's a good kickstart for Shefaly to make up her mind what people were thinking. Thank you so much.
Mine wasn't the yes, though. I still said no.
Great. So I think audience is still joining in, and 18, one more to the no. A very warm welcome to everybody for Prime Time at 9. This is the 62nd episode. We are very happy to welcome you all on a brand new episode. A very good afternoon, good evening, good morning to wherever you are. And the basic ground rules, as I told you, please be on mute, put your questions and your views on the chat window. You are also free to unmute yourself and ask a question in the end. I think with that, let me hand it over to KG sir. KG sir.
Yeah, I think without much further ado, I let Sujit do the introduction for Shefaly, and then after that, Shefaly will take over and with her talk. And like we already said, we'll have the Q&A at the end. So over to you, Sujit.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, Shefaly. I don't know. I can't see you. Are you there? Oh, I can see you there.
I see your. Hello, Manoj Bhatt.
Hi, Shefaly. See you.
Yeah.
You can see me, right, Mr. Bakshi?
Okay to start?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, Shefaly, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I know it was a bit of a surprise for you when I spoke to you. I'll give a little background of our first meeting at Ahmedabad. I think it was in 1996. I'm not too sure. Is that correct? You're on mute. Shefaly, you're on mute. You are on mute.
We met in Calcutta in 94 in December. You hired.
90.
Yeah. I was an out of campus hire.
Yeah, out of campus placement, right. And coming from Ahmedabad, the equivalent of a GLC program was the SMT program in HCL. And I met her in Calcutta, out of campus. And she says, you want to join HCL because she had heard a lot and she liked the entrepreneurial spirit. I said, that's fine. With all these starry eyes that you have, all the dream that you have, how would you like peddling boxes in the streets of Kolkata? And especially in a segment, we used to call it the first time user. So coming from Ahmedabad with a large, very dreamy eyes, she never thought that she would be peddling uh, hardware, which perhaps sometimes didn't work, to dealers in the lanes and violence of Kolkata. That's how we started. And then, of course, from there, she has traversed a lot, frontline Delhi, and then she was from there, that girl with a lot of energy, a lot of passion, a lot of dream, traveled quite a lot to getting a PhD from Cambridge. And the last I heard, I met her was at CP's daughter's marriage, and I don't think in her looks or her behavior she's changed anywhere from when I first met her in Kolkata in Jaisalmer Road. She looked the same smile and same innocence. A little bit of other side of Shefaly, which I'll share with you, which is private and personal, but I'm taking the liberty because she's not much older than my daughter. So there is another guy known as DK, same batch from Ahmedabad. And so DK was in Noida as an EA to Shivnadar, the founder of HCL. And Shefaly, after Calcutta stint, was posted in Noida. And then, I was very, my interaction with all the SMTs or GLCs was was very intense, reviews, all that. And one day I get a card, invitation that she's getting married to DK. I said, pleasant surprise, but total surprise. I didn't know. DK was a very quiet type and Shefaly was always bubbly. She said, Sujit, the problem is yours. If you have two young people, bright people, working late in the office till 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, what is to expect? That's the typical Shefaly answer. Thank you, Shefaly, for accepting this invitation. I think we've had various, the background of this prime time, I'm sure Jagdish and KG and all have explained to you. But I think yours, being the 51st or whatever is the number, is a little different because your background is so different from the other speakers. Extremely impressive. Your background is so very rich, from that little girl in Kolkata Jautala Road to the PhD from Cambridge. Uh, Makes me feel very proud that I was at the start of her career. I knew you. Over to you, KG and Jagdish, and that's all. Thank you so much, Shefaly, and taking this invitation.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
so much. Thank you so much, Sujidra. And over to you, Shafali, without wasting any time. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. Could I see the survey result one more time? Is it possible?
Of course, yes. Of course, yes.
Deep, can you share your screen with the mentee?
Deep. Or if you have taken the
Right.
screenshot, you can share that. Super.
Okay. So we have 24 people who responded to my question. My question was, at the start of Q4 2019, were you thinking about a pandemic? And the answer is in front of you. There's literally one person, whereas the pink stack of no has been growing since we started the video call with all of you. So thank you, first of all, for being honest on the survey, because you could have said anything. Nobody knows who's saying what. I think about March 2020, the Canadian Society of Actuaries came out with the results of a survey they did in November 2019, which is around the time where we are trying to figure out this question as well. The report found that pandemic risk was third in the list of undervalued risks. I want you to think about that for a second. third in the list of undervalued risks. Not only undervalued, third in the risk. So you are not alone if you were not thinking about a pandemic in Q4 2019. Mind you, these are actuaries. Their entire reason for existing is to assess risks accurately, and this was their finding about the actuary thinking. If you were to repeat this exercise honestly across boardrooms anywhere in the world, you won't find outcomes that are very different. So it doesn't have to be said again, but I'll say it anyway. You are not alone if you were not thinking of a pandemic. But whether we were factoring it in or not, the pandemic came anyway. And my understanding is that almost all of you are in the sales and business development organization inside Tech Mahindra. You're bearing the brunt of it, whether you saw it coming or not. And your responsibility remains huge because you're the people who generate revenue. You're the people who bring in the money that makes everything else possible, including producing shareholder returns that your CEO has to commit to the market. As the wisdom stands, never let a crisis go to waste. So we are putting this crisis to good use, the stasis that you're experiencing with your clients, to understanding what we could have done or what we could do in the future so that this stasis doesn't repeat for us and we are better prepared if ever in our lifetime there was a second pandemic or there are other kinds of risks that are also available. So what is risk? Now, normally this is such a dry topic that it's better to make it interactive and ask you guys for a definition. But since that's not possible in the virtual environment without creating a lot of ruckus, I'm going to go ahead and give you the definition. A risk is a potentially undesirable event which can lead to a harm or a loss, and the probability of that harm or a loss coming to pass. So there are three elements. There's an undesirable event, there's a potential for harm, and then there is a probability of those harms coming to pass. All three of these are quite hard to assess for various reasons. The first reason is quite simple. We don't look hard enough. Our horizon scanning is quite poor. It's limited by our biases and prejudices. We don't update our opinions very frequently. If we have an opinion, we stick to it. We hang around in the same echo chambers with the same friends and family. We don't like being challenged, including by data. If you look around you, whether in business context or familial debates or discussions around politics or particular issues, you will find the same thing coming back again and again. We just don't look hard enough. Second, we are not always able to assess how probable events are. And when probability is stated in quantitative terms for us, we actually don't know how to make sense of it. So for instance, throughout summer, every day, weather forecast in London says 30% chance of rain, 60% chance of rain. Do you think anyone knows what that means? Nobody knows. What we are really interested in is deciding whether or not to carry an umbrella. And just to be on the safe side, we just carry an umbrella. If it comes back dry, good for us. If it doesn't, at least it saved us being caught in the rain. The third reason why we don't assess these three factors correctly is because we are cognitively lazy. We want to do things quick and dirty rather than do the thinking necessary for assessing the harmful impact or the risk that if it should come to pass. And even if we complete that exercise, we don't always do anything about communicating that risk or preparing for it. A very good example is this pandemic. The United States and the United Kingdom are two countries really badly affected by the pandemic. It might surprise some of you, if not most of you, to know that both countries carried out pandemic risk assessment preparedness exercises some years ago. In fact, if you go to the gov.uk website, you can find the pandemic flu preparedness pages even now on the UK government website. How they actually dealt with the pandemic when it landed on their doorstep is a matter of a lot of column inches in newspapers, which tells you knowing about the risk doesn't mean that you're ready to deal with it. That requires you to do some preparation and thinking. So, sorry.
Please go on mute. Somebody is unmuted. Thank you.
Thank you. So, being aware of this doesn't mean you're ready to deal with it.
I think it's Jagdish's line. Yeah.
Thank you. Are we good to go? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Shefaly, can you unmute yourself?
I did, yeah. And though these risks exist, we know that in order to gain a return, we have to accept some risk. Typically in investment, people tell you that the higher the return in expectation or potential, the higher the risk. But equally, there is no guarantee that just because you accepted more risk, you're going to get a high return. A good example of this would be startup investments. They are potentially high risk, but they are not necessarily always high return. 80% of startups go bust within the first 5 years of them being formed. If you keep track of the asset management market in the UK, you may have heard of a person called Neil Woodford. He was a much celebrated asset manager. When he moved away from what he understood, which was investing in listed businesses, and started investing in unlisted startups in areas he didn't fully understand, his entire investment record and reputation came down and became a heap of nothing. So understanding risk as a relationship to return is important, but it's important to know that there's no guarantee that you get a high return just because you accept more risk. The risks we have heard about most lately are COVID-related risks. And those of you, once again, who live in the UK and the US will know very acutely that the disproportionately vast number of people dying in these two countries are Black or Asian origin people. Why is that the case? We don't have a definitive answer yet. We have some assessment from Public Health England and from a very big data analysis team in Oxford, but they haven't got a definitive answer. But we know that being over 60, being male, having pre-existing conditions such as excess weight, cardiovascular diseases, particularly diabetes, they increase the risk of COVID becoming a deadly disease for some people. Now, through all of this, what I have noticed when information was coming at us thick and fast, and we were learning more about the virus, we were learning about how it's manifesting in people, what are the various symptoms that you should call the doctor for, and so on. We noticed that people were freezing. They didn't know how to process this information. So when there is a lot of information around us, the combination of us not looking hard enough but finding it anyway, and our being cognitively lazy becomes a real challenge. But in order to function, we still need to take stock of the risks in front of us. We need to peg those risks correctly with what we call our risk appetite. So for instance, I have a friend who's 40-something years old, has no pre-existing conditions, and by virtue of being female, you would say that her overall risk of getting COVID-19 is very low. But her risk appetite is an altogether different thing because she's sheltering 2 people in her family who have pre-existing chronic conditions, and therefore she becomes the risk to them. So her risk appetite, deciding whether she goes out of the house or hangs out at a beer party with a friend or so on, is tempered by the risks that she's unwilling to take for her family. So some of you might know Tim Harford, who's a well-known economist. He wrote recently that the next stage of the fight against COVID-19 will require a subtlety that law cannot give, that law cannot provide, which means we are going to have to acquire risk literacy to assess and understand the risks that we are taking so that we can decide to what extent we are willing to accept those risks. And of course, all of this requires a calm temperament to do some risk assessment and deal with the risks that we identify. So instead of giving you more sort of theoretical background and giving you some illustrative examples, let's take a specific example. And I came up with the possible scenarios in discussions with KG. So let's say you're in the middle of agreeing an important strategic alliance with the company, and you've spent a lot of time and effort into it, but the discussion after many, many months is going nowhere. You're under pressure to close because you have told the senior leadership team who have talked about it to the customers, to the stock market. You've told your team. You have made some revenue projections on the basis of the alliance getting signed. You're under pressure from your boss, but crucially, you're under pressure from yourself because you have staked a lot of professional reputation on this alliance going forward. How can risk literacy help you in assessing why the deal is not getting signed Is it going to get signed? What form it might take? What further compromises you might have to make, and so on. So for starters, having this risk literacy allows you to undertake risk assessment whereby you can identify the potential events that can cause the deal to fall through or be delayed in a way that you don't like. And secondly, you can then evaluate those risks and make a judgment about how much of that risk you're willing to tolerate in exchange for the returns that you expect the deal is going to get you. Now, risks could be strategic or operational. And here I'm going to take a little detour, and I do apologize in advance for using this story for those colleagues who are not of Indian origin and may or may not know the Mahabharata, which is a big epic in the Indian culture. There is an ace archer in Mahabharata called Arjun, and his archery skills are apparently his main competitive advantage. So there are two stories which are completely different and illustrate the strategic and operational perspective in a good light. So there's one story when he's young and he's training, taking archery lessons with a teacher alongside all his brothers and 100 cousins and so on. And the teacher sets them a task. There's a bird in a tree, and they're supposed to get the arrow in the eye of the bird. So the teacher starts by asking all of his brothers and cousins, what do they see? Some people see the bird, some people see the branch the bird is sitting on, some people see the leaves, some see the tree, and some see the entire blue sky behind the tree. Arjun sees the eye of the bird, and his arrow, understandably, reaches the eye of the bird because that is a place where he needed to focus on the operational challenge of getting the arrow in the eye of the bird. However, later, Arjun goes to war. In this, Mahabharata is the story of a big internecine war. Arjun goes to war, and on the war field, he freezes. He doesn't want to kill his teacher. He doesn't want to kill his cousins, his brother, his relatives. And he gets given this almighty lecture by Krishna, which became the book Bhagavad Gita, where he's given the big picture, the idea of his duty, and to place his actions in the context of that duty. So in a way, this is an interesting example of the same person who's capable of doing very good assessment of what the operational requirement is, completely missing the point of the strategic requirement of his existence on the battlefield. I use these stories sometimes to give you a kind of illustrative example that you can hook in your mind and carry away with you. Because there is also a time where it is important to know that this bird that they were targeting was made of clay, but if it were a real bird, she might have flown away. Other birds might have come by. So the problem definition might have changed. So when you're doing risk assessment, the dynamicity of the context is also important to remember. So what are some strategic risks? Well, in the post-COVID world, the mere existence of a company, the fact that it's a going concern is a very big strategic risk. There are companies that just couldn't function. They couldn't continue selling, and they don't have a lot of money. It is particularly in asset management boardrooms, which is what my normal habitat is these days, we are having to look very closely at the risk of particular companies in the portfolio, where the sector is under duress, where the company is under duress, whether they will have a capital raising event, whether they will survive 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, right? And this is a very real risk right now. So if you're in the middle of an alliance making situation, pay particular attention right now to whether the partner company is going to survive the next 3, 6, 9 months or not. How do you ascertain this kind of risk? Well, if it's a listed company, it's easy. Their financial statements are in public domain. You can look through the papers to see their assets, their liabilities, their operating surplus, how much cash in the bank they have, how many months they can go, did they take advantage of any government support, what those monies came with, what conditions came with it. And you're thinking, right, okay, this is great for listed companies. What about companies that are privately held? They are very high risk because you're either depending on their disclosure to you, or you're depending on proxy indicators. Are other companies in the sector doing well? How many customers does this company have? How many customers with long-term contracts does this company have? How many of those customers are going to survive? So you have to go for the deep dive. But essentially, the strategic risk of mere survival is quite huge in the current time. That is not the only strategic risk, by the way, that we face. Some of you will know how Tech Mahindra came to acquire Satyam. Satyam was the outcome after Satyam's very public governance failure. It became an asset that could not continue surviving on its own. And Tech Mahindra was one of the companies that came in and rescued rescued it. So it was a rescue acquisition. But governance failures, particularly fraud, are a fairly high strategic risk for companies. Reputational damage is another one. Unsustainability of the strategy or the business model, or the sudden emergence overnight of a competitor who completely changes the economics of the business model that the company uses. So that's a major risk. A very good example of that would be Netflix and Blockbuster. And Netflix was a tiny company which was still sending DVDs by post to to their subscribers. They tried to sell themselves to Blockbuster for $50 million. Blockbuster turned it down. I believe Blockbuster shut down their last store last year, or maybe late the year prior to it. Regulatory and compliance failures can also shut a business overnight. There is a particular fintech in the UK, which is a challenger bank, which is in the business newspapers for all the wrong reasons right now. And that's a risk all over the place. It's a privately held company, but the risk proxies are all over the news. So if you are keeping track, you will know what kind of risk this particular company is subjected to. Of course, loads of operational risk can scupper your team as well. You're all techies, you know that the biggest risk is data breaches, compromises, cyber attacks. They are the top of all the risk matrices that we are looking at. But a very important, crucial risk is operational change or organizational change, particularly people who change. So let's say you have a coach inside a company, or you have a particular champion inside a company. If they lose their power or their clout, or they move on, and you have no idea they're moving on, or they get fired and put on gardening leave without naming a successor clearly for you to deal with, that's something that's a huge operational risk for you that can completely derail your conversation with them. So being aware of all of these risks is crucially important. But once you analyze the risks in a situation, you need to decide what's your risk strategy. Are you willing to continue to give this deal, this alliance conversation, the benefit of your resources? And your resources are mainly your attention and your time. Another question to ask would be, are you going to diversify and start to look at some other possible alliances? Are you happy to drop this deal together? Remember, these questions are not completely exhaustive in totality, but they are illustrative of the various ways our risk appetite, our risk tolerance meets the risk of a particular situation or a conversation or an alliance. I understand this is a fairly dry topic, so it's probably better if I answer some questions which you guys might have. But before I do that and open the floor to questions, I'll reiterate some of the takeaways. One, return and risk are related, though taking a big risk is not a guarantee of big return. Two, risk literacy requires both big picture awareness as well as narrow focus simultaneously. Three, risk assessment requires that we get good at horizon scanning, addressing our cognitive biases and our echo chambers, building a broader awareness of the context of business, as well as potentially acquiring skills such as reading financial statements because they contain a lot of information. The risk of unquoted businesses, we all understand, is amplified because so much information is just not there in the public domain. Four, knowing the risks is insufficient, we must have a strategy to deal with the risks. Five, we must communicate the risks clearly to the interested stakeholders and keep them informed. And last but not the least, we must refresh our risk awareness periodically. In most boardrooms, risk matrix updation is almost a weekly exercise these days, but normally a quarterly exercise. In the current scenario, you're going to have to do this risk assessment on all your alliance partners, all your clients dynamically to see who might not exist tomorrow and be therefore unable to do business with you. Finally, there is a saying which explains very clearly that nothing in the world we do is risk-free. The safest place for a ship where it's completely free of all risks is the harbor. But that's not what ships are built for. Ships are built for dealing with rough oceans, exploration, trade, going out into the horizon and finding out what's out there. This is no different from all of you guys who are in sales and business development. You go out, you look at new opportunities, you bring revenue, you bring the business that keeps the company going. There's no such thing as risk-free selling. Thank you for your time. I'll take questions if you wish.
Hey, thank you much, Shefaly. Thank you so very much. I mean, there's another saying, right? The most risk-free place in the world is 6 feet under the ground in a cemetery. So, and so there are few questions here. Jagdish, I'm sure, will want to ask a question. Manoj Bhatt is there. He might want, but I'll start with one because you're such a illustrious person with a career, and in the place where you are. So somebody who wants to actually ask you a very different kind of a question. The question is, what's your advice to those aspiring to be on the board of companies?
I think this is an out of syllabus question.
I know. I deliberately started with that. Yeah.
But I'll address it. I think it is not technical skills that are the crucial factor for people to serve on boards. Technical skills are what we used to call in MBA speak hygiene factors. Without them, you are nowhere. But what really makes you a good, effective board director is having perspective. And I know that this is going out on Facebook Live, so I'm going to keep my examples parental guidance oriented. Occasionally, I have been the person who highlights the most weird risks to my board colleagues. And over time, they have come to understand that that's because my news and information metabolism is quite high, and my news and information diet is quite varied. So I kind of see things, even if they are low probability, I flag them because their impact could be disproportionate on our business model, on our profitability, on our shareholder returns, on our stakeholder returns. But the key thing is that the importance of perspective cannot be overstated. That and the fact that you need to have some confidence in holding your own when you're at the table. Maybe this doesn't apply to a lot of people, but to some people, and there's a lot of discussion about it in women's business groups, having the confidence to hold your own once you are at the table, because having a seat at the table isn't important. Being heard when you're there is. Some of you may know that I think it was an Uber event where Ariana Huffington was mocked on stage live by a fellow board director, and she let it pass. And my observation then was, if they are willing to do this to her, somebody of her standing in public, what do they do to her in a boardroom where nobody else no external eyes are present? So I think the match between who you are, what your skill set and personality and perspective is, and the culture of the company that you want to serve on the board of, that's a crucial thing in successfully serving on the board of a company as well.
Fantastic. Coming back to syllabus,
yeah.
Why did the risk models fail in anticipate? I mean, it's an easy, passe question, I guess. Why did the risk models fail in anticipating COVID?
I don't think the risk models failed, not so much for countries. As I mentioned when I was speaking, that the UK and the US, both governments actually did pandemic preparedness exercises. Under Barack Obama, there was a substantial amount of investment in people to create a team that was about horizon scanning for pandemics and where they could come from. In the UK, the pandemic preparedness for a flu-like disease is still there. The material is still there from 2011, updated in 2016. The models didn't fail. The human beings using those models did not take their thinking to the logical progression, which was completing the thinking and investing in the preparedness. So-called developed countries shouldn't be caught short of personal protective equipment if they were ready for a pandemic or an infectious disease breakout. And it never happened. I mean, our failures are so well documented that I don't need to go over them. So the models didn't fail. Models are only as good as the people who are putting them to use. It is people and leadership who failed. And that is true for companies just as much as it has been true of the countries. In case of boardrooms, we are required, at least in the UK, the Financial Reporting Council requires us to report on emerging risks. So we have a lot of visioning exercises and flights of fancy and imagination to figure out what might happen. And I can still assure you, if you go back and read people's annual reports, just take FTSE 100 annual reports, you won't find pandemic listed anywhere, maybe one or two. So because the last pandemic was 100 years ago, it's a failure of imagination. We just don't think it'll happen to us. We just think we are ready. We can deal with anything. So models are just as good as the people who are using them.
Okay. And again, slightly on the border of, syllabus, not syllabus.
Mhm.
The question is, have you seen high risk, high reward scenario in your career? And how did you mitigate the high risk situation in such a situation?
Well, my entire career in HCL after Mr. Bakshi hired me was a high risk, high return scenario. That's why I joined them. The entire senior management trainee program, all the projects we did were high risk, high return. Because if we failed, our entire peer group would know that we failed. So at the very least, we would lose our reputation. But in terms of high return, we had a very different career trajectory compared to the others who were not on the senior management trainee track. In fact, there's an internal senior management trainee that Mr. Bakshi may or may not remember, who recently I gave a reference for him to join the main board of a massive bank, which is listed in the UK. And it is essentially a very high risk gamble he took because he still works inside a bank. And I warned him that when you do take the risk to go and interview with the board of another bank, this bank is not going to like it. And he said, but I need to reset the trajectory of my professional career. So he took the risk and he's being selected to serve on the board, and he'll now have to negotiate with his employer. So observing other people's trajectories using their examples as well. But yeah, my early career was all high risk, high return. I did weird things that none of my peer group from IIM the Bud was doing at the time. So it was high risk in that everybody thought you were crazy, but I'm not.
You pulled
I
it off.
think.
And Kanchan Bonde wants to know, what risks do you think we should consider in the post-COVID era as we try and limp back to normalcy?
I think the first risk for pretty much all businesses at the moment is survival. Like a genuine test to say how many months can you live if you had no revenue for 3, 6, 9 months. That is the biggest risk to most businesses at the moment. Some sectors are more at risk than others are. We are probably all keeping track of all the airline companies fighting with various governments for reducing quarantine periods and meanwhile firing all the people and so on and so forth. So even if you survive, what we are enabling companies to do right now is to survive so that we have something left to build on. All the government packages that went to support companies was to help them through. So they survived and something was left to build on. So that is the second risk, that you figure out what is going on with your sector and what are the various risks for restarting your business. And I kind of liken it to, somebody in my neighborhood actually got his license taken away for some speeding violation for 18 months. And he had a very nice car that just sat there covered with a, tarpaulin for those 18 months. And after 18 months, that car couldn't be driven. I think a lot of companies are like that car right now. They are going to have to need quite a lot to kickstart them back into a place where they can generate revenue. And that is the second sort of risk. The other risk that we are not looking at from a business perspective, but we really should, and we were joking about this, a friend of mine and I, for the last 3 months, we are going to get a revolution. We were joking. And now when you look at all the race-related protests in the UK and the US and all around the world in countries that call themselves the West and beyond, that is a substantial risk. And that risk is not going to come in the form of somebody setting fire to his office building. That
Hey guys,
risk,
go on mute, please.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So that risk is going to manifest in a very different way, and the return will be probably a better inclusive society. It will start with looking at people's boardrooms and leadership teams. Every brand has put out a statement or the other. I'm keeping track of the brands that have actually put out concrete steps they will undertake. And so far, I have identified 3. One is PwC, one is Uber, and the third one is, I think, Accenture, who have said that we will publish the metrics. We are going to make targets for recruiting people to our boardroom. We are going to make targets for recruiting people to our senior leadership team. There will be no token hiring. All the work of race relations is not going to fall on people of color. We underestimate that change at our peril. It is a genuine, dramatic social change. People are just fed up. So we could be underestimating it, but it is an emerging risk in my view.
And Manoj Bhatt with that has put up his hand. So Manoj, go ahead, make my day.
Uh, First of all, Shefaly, wonderful to see you after a long time. I think great insights. So, I think I went through what you said in terms of risk being probabilistic, risk being, and you also said execution matters on risk management, right? So, if we think about it differently, I have two questions for you, right? So, from a COVID perspective, as a company, what could we have done different? And as individuals, what can we do different going forward? So both aspects. So if you can shed some light, that would be wonderful. And wonderful to see you again.
Thank you. So, what could we have done differently as a company? Hindsight is 2020. Everybody can look back and say we could have done this, we could have done that. But I can talk about something that relates to one of the boards I sit on. And should we be so unfortunate as to see another pandemic in our lifetime, it could be a good model to kind of think about. So I'm also an independent governor of a university in London. 60% of our students are Black and ethnic minorities, and we serve around 10,000 students. Because of historical reasons, we are one of the few universities that's financially secure with no debt on our books. We are London based. It's called London Metropolitan University. It was in January when nobody in the UK was taking seriously the possibility of the pandemic arriving here, the virus arriving here, that the Vice Chancellor and the senior leadership team and the board all worked together and the business continuity plan was kickstarted. By February, all the board meetings went virtual and they became higher in frequency. So we became more accessible. I'm currently serving also as the chair of the governance committee. I will become the chair of audit committee from the next academic year, which starts August. So the chairman of various committees talk a lot between themselves alongside the board chair and the vice chancellor. Our communications became more frequent. I conducted my first virtual governance committee meeting as chair in February. So we were still in February. There was no discussion around the virus coming to the UK in big numbers, although people in Italy had started to die. This was around Pancake Tuesday, Shrove Tuesday, sort of third week of February. So the business continuity plan was in. The board went virtual. We have a very strong virtual learning environment. We tested it for scalability. And then the staff, half went home and half was working from campus. So they tested how the working from home thing works. And then around early March, we were amongst the first universities to physically shut down the campus and send everybody to work from home, study from home, and so on. And all the staff who had physical responsibilities, estate management and so on, were deployed in supporting students who were finding it difficult to get online, continue with the classes. Before everybody was sent home, the vice chancellor, who's a highly empathetic woman, took stock of which students did not have the technology infrastructure to study from home. A lot of our students are first in their clan to go to university. They come from difficult, disadvantaged backgrounds. We cannot extend the assumptions about our life into their lives. So we bought a whole bunch of Chromebooks and internet access dongles and gave them out to the students. So the enablement of the people whom you're serving, who your main customer is, the main stakeholder is. So all of this happened. Now, looking back on this, I would say any organization should have looked at their business continuity plan when the Chinese numbers started to come out late December. Should have started to test the scalability of their remote working, especially the safe security, doing it securely, because you also probably handle a lot of customer confidential information. The management team actually becoming less managerial, but more pastoral caregivers, because one of the challenges of people who work in teams is when those teams physically scatter, there is a dramatic emotional impact on people, which they may not be able to articulate because we don't always have the words to articulate what we are feeling. There's a very interesting film called Inside Out, I think, which is an animation film. It's worth seeing because the child is basically moving somewhere with her parents and she learns to express her various feelings. Quite an interesting film. So people don't always have words to say why they are not functioning. And we expect that we will function as normal when really a part of ourselves is our team and that has been yanked away from us. So in hindsight being 2020, these are the things that a business could have done. Kickstart, test your business continuity plan frequently. It's like a fire drill in a building. And it's not that dissimilar to how individuals should probably consider risks. We all avoid discussing all kinds of things, but it's worth discussing what happens if somebody who's the main income generator in the family cannot work anymore. Or what happens if there is a calamity of any other kind. I have a friend here who has two small children. Her husband went to India for some health emergency with his parents. And then the borders shut down. He's still in India. She's doing a fairly powerful job here remotely with two children under her feet who also need to do their schooling. And when I spoke with her one Friday evening, she was laughing in resignation, saying, I have no idea how I'm functioning. So there are people who are in those situations too. And as individuals, we must think about where is our backup? Where is our risk assessment? Where is our sort of risk mitigation plan, as it were? How are we likely to function if the following things weren't to work? And for what it's worth, I'm one of those people who actually stockpiled some food in February. And it was very wise to have done that because in March, we were hard pressed to get a slot from Ocado for delivery. I've been an Ocado customer for 10 years. We couldn't get a delivery slot. So it was good that there was food in the house and we could go to a corner shop and get some fresh stuff. But I was roundly laughed at throughout February. I don't give a shit. You know me enough to know that. And equally, our risk assessment, we have to take that into account. If our risk modeling says this is what we need to feel secure, we go ahead and do it. Never mind popular opinion.
So Manoj, the second question.
Let me ask you a different question, right? Next 4 quarters.
Next 4 quarters, I can only tell you from the perspective of all the various companies that I'm seeing here. First test is survival. People are trying to figure out, can we pass the next quarter, forget next 4 quarters. 2, what are the assumptions in our...
First, on a personal perspective, sorry.
Okay, so in personal perspective, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people do is that they rely on a salary. So testing your employer's ability to not go bust is a fairly big risk assessment move. The other would be to see how much risk you're willing to take. The opening up that's happening in the UK is kind of random. So for instance, hairdressers are not opening till July, when hairdressers could very well do their jobs wearing masks and visors, giving their customers the same, reducing the risk. But somehow pubs are opening on June 22nd because pubs put more money in the Chancellor of the Exchequer's coffers than hairdressers do, presumably. So those kinds of personal risk assessments in terms of what risk we can take in terms of going out, etc. People who have elderly people in the family or people with chronic diseases need to do a very hard assessment of where their risk lies and conduct the next few months of our life thinking we could get it any time. What are the mitigations we can do to prevent it from happening, and then if it happens, to deal with it.
So Manoj Bhatt has done a very good risk assessment of his hairdresser. He has a very sharp haircut, and so your teacher wants to ask you a question. Sujit Bakshi raised his hand.
Yeah. Yes, Shefaly. Sorry, am I audible? I mean, my sound somewhere, the network is not too good here. But can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So one is my memory. I just struggle. I mean, when he met in Kolkata, the job we had from campus Lakme, is that correct? 6 months into the job was Lakme?
Yes.
Oh, so fine. So I'm still not denied. No. The question that I have is much more pre-COVID.
Yeah.
I take 2 airlines, Jet Airways and Kingfisher. I'm sure somebody did risk assessment for them, but it failed. Is it because the promoters were too control oriented? Is that they ignored any risk advice? Why did it fail? Is it a promoter issue, the management culture issue, or egoistic promoters who didn't listen to risk? I'm sure they would have had some risk assessment. So I'm going to much more pre-COVID,
Yeah.
and that may be relevant
Yeah.
for the situation that we're handling now.
One of the things I have seen in my still short board career is that good boards do not preside over badly run companies, and bad boards don't preside over well-run companies. So to me, all of those look like failures of governance. And governance failure doesn't have to come from the board failing. We know from a lot of Silicon Valley companies that are listed where voting control remains with the founders of the company. That's a governance condition that the market should not have accepted. But now that they have accepted them, they're lying in the bed they made. And I would be surprised if that was similar in the airline companies that went bust pre-COVID in India. And in fact, if there was one factor explanation, I should think that it was a governance failure more than anything else. If nobody is watching what you're doing with the money that the markets have given you, and they are not discharging those duties properly, they're equally culpable. And that happens a lot in the West as well. And of course, I mentioned Satyam. We know that that was an outright fraud. We knew it afterwards, but nobody on their board actually could see, and their auditor had some competence issues as well. All of those things together make a governance challenge for a company, and it's very difficult to survive all of that stuff. If you're a big enough company, you can go bust overnight. That is the lesson we all take from it.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. And so we'll, take Manoj Bhatt's CFO position as a segue to the next question from Seema Tarve. She
Okay.
said you've probably seen Tech Mahindra details, at least those in the public domain. Where do you see Techem in the 3-6-9 month window that you spoke about?
I will honestly say that I'm not a shareholder of your company, so I don't have any particular reason to look deeply into your financial records. And I also did not talk to CP before this because I would have asked him. So I'm afraid I can't give you a great answer to that. But on a fairly broadly generic basis, if you wanted to do this analysis yourself, you could look at the various sectors that you serve, what percentage of revenue comes from which sector, and what pressures those sectors are under from a risk perspective, and how that might impact your revenue over the 3, 6, 9 months ahead. Balance that revenue expectation against those clients' ability to pay, because there are some sectors that are under tremendous pressure and some sectors that are not. And within the sector, you'll find variations. So for instance, insurance companies are under a lot of pressure for companies to invoke their business insurance, wanting some coverage for the loss of revenue, etc. But at the same time, insurance companies are not making payouts for automobile accidents for the last 3 months because everybody was home, nobody was going anywhere. So you have to, within the sector, see who's sitting on a pile of cash and who's not sitting on a pile of cash. So I would leave it as an academic exercise for you to look at your own company's, financial records and look at things by sector, do a sector-based analysis, do a customer-based analysis to see how many of the revenue projections will actually hold good in the next 3, 6, 9 months.
Okay. So here's a question from Amol Jain. Clearly, he's a salesman, it looks like.
Good.
He said, what is easier, risk assessment or opportunity citing? Do you see that as one role? Do you foresee organizations will have such roles, or will COVID create these roles?
They are one and the same thing. The whole purpose of doing this session with the business development and salespeople in the organization was to make everyone realize that they're not separate jobs. It's not someone else's job to do risk assessment on an opportunity you are looking at. It is your job because you are supposed to know that organization, that client's main leadership, the particular coach inside the organization. You're supposed to know it better than anyone else in your organization. So they are not separate roles. They are the same role. They're absolutely the same role because opportunity is essentially the other side of risk. Risk can give you an opportunity for building returns, although taking risk will not automatically generate returns. So that's the short answer for your question. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Okay. And Sanjay Mitra asks here, his question came ahead of time. Says,
Mhm.
what is the difference between a risk taker and a calculated risk taker in business?
Calculated risk taker has done probably a better job of figuring out what the return is and how the match between his or her risk appetite and the particular risk at hand works out. And interesting, the challenge with risk is that it's only as good as the risk we are willing to stomach. Many years ago, I remember I wrote something about risk literacy. And I don't think you were expecting a discussion around Angelina Jolie, but now you've got it. Angelina Jolie's mother died of a particular genetic mutation which gave her breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and she died quite young. So a few years ago, Angelina Jolie assessed her risk and decided to have preventative removal of her ovaries and her breasts. And then she wrote about it in New York Times. And through the whole article, you will find that that was a risk she was unwilling to take, the risk of dying at the age of 46, 47, whatever her mom's age was when she died. So knowing the risk is one thing. Putting 82% risk of dying of ovarian cancer is one thing. Are you willing to stomach the ovarian cancer risk? That is the real question. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who had her first child at the age of 36, and she was given 1 in 1200 chance of having a baby with Down syndrome. So I asked her, what does it mean? She said, sounds good enough, I'll take it. That's what she did. Child is, all grown up now and everything. But that was the interesting thing. So risk and calculated risk and everything is the key word here is not risk and calculated risk. Key word here is taker. Will you stomach that risk because you see a reward at the end of it? And that's essentially the assessment we need to make, which is why we must sharpen our judgment of the risk that we are looking at.
The key word is the taker.
Yeah.
All right. And Nupur Rabi here has a question which says that faced with a 1/3 dip in share prices, what would be the first reaction for risk management?
What 1/3? I sit on the board of a company that went from 1.2 billion pound in valuation to 580 million. So this is not theoretical for me. I'm just going to check the share price because trading has just stopped. Yes, 580.5 million today. So what does it look like for risk? In case of an asset management company, you look at your portfolio and see if the share price is going to continue a nosedive, because the shock of the share price wore out, the share price fall wore out, and then there was an upturn in the prices. But not all upturns were equal, because they were all dependent on different risk assessments given to particular companies. In case of a portfolio, which is an asset management company's job, you look at every company in the portfolio and you see whether their contribution to your growth or shrinkage is going to be beyond your ability to continue to keep them in your portfolio. So you sell some, you buy some, you strengthen some positions, you figure out your other covenants, and you make sure that you have enough cash, and so on and so forth. So yeah, you essentially do a risk assessment around, like literally 360 risk assessment, and decide whether it is something you want to tolerate. Do you want to move the pieces around, change the risk profile? And you make those decisions and implement them.
Yeah. So this question of Sri Charan Kuppam again sounds a little similar. What he says is, what does a risk strategist strike? How does a risk strategist strike a balance between pessimism and optimism? Because as a strategist's primary job is to identify, tendency is to create the wall and, you figure it out. But how do you kind of, do the pessimism, optimism, and how to kind of help jump over the wall, so to speak? That's what I think he means.
I think a glib answer to that would be by tempering them with realism. Pessimism is what tells you that everything will go to pot, the world will finish, and everything will get burnt down. We'll all die. We'll all die anyway. Optimism is what tells you what is possible. If you take these risks, everything works out fine. That's where we can go. But realism is what tells you this is what we have right now. Can we take a calm and collected view of what we have and how we can work with it to make the optimistic scenario more feasible than the pessimistic scenario. So it is difficult to keep the individual temperament or the emotion of optimism, pessimism out, but that is why a leadership team is a team. A board doesn't consist of one person, there are several people. Everyone makes their contribution, they discuss various things, and then they decide this is the collective action we are going to take. Everybody gets their buy-in in place, and then you take the actions to make the optimistic scenario more likely than the pessimistic one.
All right. I see somebody raise the hand, but I can't figure out who that is. So if you, whoever that is, you want to ask the question? Somebody's raised a hand, but it's okay.
Jagdish has raised his hand, I think.
Oh, he has?
Your hand up?
You're mute. You're on mute.
Okay.
Hi, Shefaly. I think one of the points, and I think this group probably would be better off having a discussion, not just better off, but an engaging conversation on the variety of topics that we chatted about, including politicians, which are probably a lot more engaging for an evening conversation. But we leave it at that. But tell me a few things. You obviously, I'm assuming, have an opinion about Black Lives Matter campaign that's going on. Do you think people in power in the US have done their risk assessment on whom to support and whom not to?
I don't think it is a question of them making a decision on whom to support and whom not to. The United States is a particular interesting artifact historically, that it was like the UK to some extent. It's a nation built on slavery. And the generations from that, the slavery legacy thing is big in the American politics and society even today. There is plenty of research that shows that if your name sounds black, but your CV is identical to a white sounding name. And interestingly, research was done by an economist at Harvard called Senthil Mullainathan, who's from Madras, as you all know. So you have to send more CVs just to get the same number of interviews, or you're going to get rejections by sending identical CVs for the same job if your name sounds black. That kind of institutionalized racial discrimination is not defensible. If you're going to, and no moral reason, nothing, just sheer economics of it. You cannot keep half of your consumer base, half of your workers, the potential working population, subjugated so that they are not able to give their best to the country's growth, to this, the armed forces, to society. You just can't. So you don't even have to make a moral argument. It's a pure utilitarian argument for including everybody, including people from different races and different gender, ethnicity, etc., to make sure that the country continues to thrive and grow. One doesn't even have to make a moral argument for people who might have a different moral compass. It's a purely utilitarian argument. Hopefully that's understood by some people.
No, my point was slightly different. I think my point was that a lot of politicians calculate on the basis of what side to take based on where they come back. But we'll leave that. I was just wondering whether that assessment of risk of whether I'll come back or not was done by some people, and how do these risk assessments work?
So that's most of that risk assessment is electoral risk, because typically, at least UK, the parliament is in session for 5 years at a time. The most amount of time an MP, if he or she wins her seat or his seat, can count on is 5 years. There's no guarantee you'll come back. So all the risk assessment and calculus is about electability and electoral outcomes. And that's why they keep a tab on electoral intentions and the sentiment of the electorate to tweak the outcomes that they want while using the same evidence base that the other side might be using, but arriving at a very different conclusion.
Yeah, so I think we have the last question because we are at 10 o'clock. Yeah. And, Kamlesh Yadav, he says, he's talking about Jio, and he says, given the timing, so do you think they have really de-risked themselves by getting the promoter liquidation of shareholding in Jio, as well as, the investments done by Facebook, etc.? What's your view is what he's wanting to know.
I mean, from the point of view of Okay, so I'll start one step back. India is one of the lowest ARPU countries as far as mobile technology, mobile user markets are concerned. So how does a shareholder actually make money? And the company grows in share price, which is often based on intrinsic value of the company, the revenue the company makes, or the profitability the company makes. They're probably not going to be able to take out a lot of profit, but they do need investment in order to keep building the market, which is still ripe for more data usage, for instance. So I would say they've done, it's a smart thing to have taken Facebook's investment at this point. It is going to revive the whole free basics thing all over again. That is a risk to the country in terms of having neutral access to the internet, which is designed as an internet, as a neutral platform, and not through the Facebook gateway. You know, you don't want people in our country to be introduced to the web through the gateway of Facebook, the lens of Facebook, especially knowing what we know about Facebook's leanings towards authoritarian thinking and so on and so forth, and their completely muddled up thinking on what truth and information and fake info news, etc., are all about. So, from the point of view of the promoters, yes, they have de-risked something. From the point of view of the country, it is a very different risk calculus. Is this essentially what we need? And risk assessment is about seeing where these particular decisions could go. Where could this decision take the web access thing through geo for India, which is a relatively young democracy, but also a country with huge population of young people who need their minds open, not closed, who need their minds to be able to experience things that are theirs before they can form an opinion which is going to add value to the country. So there are a lot of different lenses even on that deal, but from the point of view of the promoters, they have definitely done a smart thing, taking the money on the table. From the point of view of the country, I'm not so sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shefaly. I don't know how the time went by so quickly, and we got your valuable, expertise, inputs, views over this 1 hour with all of. We had about 170 people logged in. We are live on Facebook, and thank you very much. And so the
Thank you.
guys on the call, thank you for attending the show. There's the feedback form to fill it up, and also give your feedback for our PrimeTime Season 2 inputs. So wherever you are in the world, thank you very much. Good evening, good night, good